Hi, everybody. Welcome to our economics kind of overview of some of the commonly missed questions for, micro and macroeconomics courses. My name is Jeffrey. I have been teaching with OneClass for several years now. Really excited to be here working with you guys. And the kind of structure we're going to follow today is I've picked out a few questions that students commonly ask or have trouble with, and we're going to go over some of the solutions to those questions and make sure they're right, and kind of elaborate on, what exactly it is that makes, that we should be thinking about when we're answering these questions. So let's take a look. I haven't taken a look at these solutions yet, so we'll see. I'll be doing it just along at the same time as you guys. Alrighty. Oh, whoop. Looks like the borders are a bit off. Let me try and fix that. Alrighty here. So on the left, we have the question, and I'll read it out loud in case it's a little hard to see. It says, first question, all of the following make up the big three credit reporting agencies except for which one? So the answer choices are Equifax, the Federal Reserve, TransUnion, or Experian. So this question doesn't seem to be very calculation or even theory based. This is just a very fact based question. And so, you know, there's two ways you can approach this question. The first one is if you just memorize the big three credit reporting agencies, you'll know that Equifax, TransUnion, and Experian are the big three credit reporting agencies. And then you can pick the Federal Reserve as the one that is not a big three reporting agencies. And that's one way we can approach this problem. And the other way we can approach it is simply saying, uh, let's use a process of elimination. Maybe we haven't memorized the big three credit reporting agencies, and I think maybe a lot of students haven't. And that's okay because what is one thing we know is not a big three credit reporting agency on this list, and that is the Federal Reserve, because we know that the Federal Reserve is very key for monetary policy, and it's one of those. It's a central bank of the United States, and it's a kind of a division of the government, not a private, credit reporting agency that kind of is a conglomerate or collects data about the different consumer credit scores across the United States, right? So we know the Federal Reserve is definitely not a big three credit reporting agency. We could also pick it that way. So let's take a look at the initial answer that was left. So we picked Federal Reserve, which is good. That's correct. And they explain Equifax, TransUnion, and Experian are the big three credit reporting agencies. All three are multinational consumer credit reporting companies that collect and aggregate information over millions of individual consumers across different countries. And then on the other hand, the Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States of America and monetary authority tasked with slight typo there, but with the responsibility of that supervising and regulating commercial banks, stabilizing the financial system, and providing financial services to the government of the United States, foreign officials, institutions, and depository institutions in the nation. So again, we know the Federal Reserve does a lot of things, and this answer has listed out many of the responsibilities of the Federal Reserve. But the one thing that the Federal Reserve is not is a big three credit reporting agency. So that is going to largely be correct, and we're going to go ahead with that one. So you can see I didn't have to do any work here. This was more of a conceptual question rather than a theory or calculation-based question. Okay, so let's take a look at this next one. So the question here says people are willing to pay more for a diamond than for a bottle of water because of which of these uh, answer choices. So we can read through, and so this is we can, before reading through the answer choices, let's think about how would we approach this question normally, right? And so we know that uh, this paradox of water versus diamonds is very common actually, and a lot of textbooks in economics will actually use this kind of dichotomy to kind of highlight the difference between uh, you know total benefit and marginal benefit, right? And so if we can draw a graph on the right hand side, if I can get this to work, here we go. So if we say total benefit is plotted out as like uh, maybe like you would increase slowly, something like this. That's total benefit, and we call that T. B, we know that marginal benefit is going to look something like this, right? We know that marginal benefit probably is going to look something like this, or maybe like something like this. All we know is that, marginal benefit, maybe something like this. We know that when we talk about marginal benefit, we're talking about the um, law of diminishing returns, right? For every additional unit of a good that we get, the next unit is going to provide us a little bit less benefit than the unit before it, right? And so there's these two different ways of looking at benefit. One is in the sum total, which is overall benefit, and the other one is the marginal benefit, which is how many units of this good do I already have, and how much extra benefit does this one additional unit of a good give me. So this is a theoretical approach to this problem. And so then we can apply that framework to these two goods, diamonds and bottles. So we would assume, right, because water is vital for life, that the total benefit of having water is very high, right? The value of water to us is extremely high as a good overall. If we had no water, we would die. We'd probably value water overall very highly. However, in most scenarios, right, we're not assuming we're in the middle of a desert or anything. In most scenarios, we already have a lot of water. So what that means is we're probably very up here, probably somewhere around here for the total benefit. Whoops. The total benefit that we already obtained from water. And we're probably, let's use this graph here, very low on the marginal benefit curve. And so that means the marginal benefit of one more additional bottle of water is fairly low. We already have a lot of water. It's not necessary for us to get additional water. Now we can think of another scenario with diamonds, where the diamonds overall probably don't have much value to us, because, if there were a lot of diamonds, they wouldn't be rare. And also, the diamonds are not necessary to be alive. And so we probably say the total benefit of diamonds is down here. But because we have so few, the marginal benefit is going to be very high, right? Because that one additional unit of diamond is going to provide us much more joy, because we don't have as many before, and there's not been that diminishing marginal returns coming into effect. So that is the basic way we look at this. So we would look for an answer choice that says the marginal benefit for a new diamond is probably going to be larger than the marginal benefit for a bottle of water. And we can see that on the graph on the right. So taking a look at these answer choices, the first one says the marginal cost of producing extra diamond far exceeds the marginal cost of producing an extra bottle of water. This is talking about the cost of production. We're referring to how much people are willing to pay, which is on the consumer side, not the supply side. The second answer says the marginal benefit of extra diamond far exceeds the marginal benefit of an extra bottle of water. That's probably, that's right along the lines of what we were looking for. Just to make sure, number three says producers of diamonds have a much greater ability to manipulate diamond prices than producers of water. Maybe, maybe not. Regardless, the price that is set by producers is not what is at hand here. It's how much people are willing to pay for a diamond. And finally, water prices are held artificially low by governments, since water is necessary for life. Maybe, maybe not. But again, we're not talking about what price control is in play. We're talking about the willingness to pay of consumers. So we're going to stick with number two. And so let's take a look at the answers that the previous tutor had written about. So they selected number two, which is good. That's the right answer. And the explanation says the theory of marginal utility states that the price of a product in a market is neither determined by how much labor was exhausted in the production of that good or service, nor by the utility of the good or service, but by its marginal utility. Yeah, exactly. So maybe not exactly how I would have worded it, but we want to refer to marginal utility above all else, right? And so the most important use of a product to an individual describes the marginal utility of the good to him or her. That, again, marginal utility, marginal benefit, we're going to be referring to the same thing here. So paradox of value arises when we realize that even though water is more useful of a commodity on the whole of our lives, diamonds command a much higher price in the market, and this can be understood with the following example. So let's take a look at this example. A farmer produces 3 bags of wheat. He uses the first bag to feed his family and himself. Second bag is traded to generate income, and a third bag is given to those in need. If in some years the farmer fails to produce 3 bags and ends up with 2 bags, he does not distribute the total amount of wheat for the 3 tasks he used to do. He will instead drop his charity and focus on feeding and trading. This is observed because the value of each bag is not equal to the farmer, as it is derived from the satisfaction the farmer receives from each of the acts. Similarly, the marginal utility derived from an additional glass of water is less than the marginal utility derived from an additional unit of a diamond if the water is available in plenty already. However, if the water is extremely scarce to the consumer and he or she is dying of thirst, then they would be willing to trade diamonds for a glass of water. Okay. Yeah. So on the whole, the same explanation that we were coming across. I'm not, I think the example is fairly illustrative. Maybe could have been a little bit better. We can leave a comment and kind of just sum up this in a little bit more concise of a manner. Why don't we say, so yes, it's the correct answer is that the marginal benefit of an extra diamond far exceeds the marginal benefit of an extra bottle of water. And we refer to this as, consumers make, or sorry, rational consumers make decisions on the margin, meaning that the most important use of a product or most important factor when purchasing a product is its marginal utility, right? And so this is kind of echoing what the tutor had previously said was the marginal utility of the good to the user. And so we're going to go back to this example. So assuming the consumer is not dying of thirst, the marginal benefit or marginal utility, we'll use the tutor's words, the marginal utility of an additional bottle of water is fairly low because water is typically available in plenty. In contrast, a diamond, the marginal utility of additional unit of diamonds is very high because most people don't have many diamonds, right? And then we can say, we'll take the exact same the line from the bottom of the tutor's existing response and say we either clarify, because if we are in a situation where the person is dying of thirst, is in the middle of the desert, has no water, then obviously that means their total benefit from water is very low. Their marginal benefit from an additional unit of water is going to be very high, and we would assume that that marginal benefit is going to be much larger for one glass of water in the desert than it would be for any amount of diamonds, right? So that's going to be our solution to this. Okay, let's take a look at the next question, and we can erase everything that we did here. So in this question, the question reads, to economists, the main difference between the short run and the long run is that A, the law of decreasing marginal returns applies in the long run, but not in the short run. B, in the short run, all inputs are fixed, while in the long run, all inputs are variable. C, fixed costs are more important to decision making in the long run than they are in the short run. D, in the long run, all inputs are variable, while in the short run, at least one input is fixed. And E, A and D. So basically, whenever we talk about short run and long run in an economics course, we're going to be referring to the idea of fixed versus variable inputs, right? And so in a short run, what we predict to, what we assume to be true is that there are certain things that you can't change. There are certain fixed costs that you're not able to vary. And so those fixed costs might be costs of rent, for example. If you're a small business and you rent a facility, cost of rent is something that's not really going to change in the short run. And so that's kind of that difference. And in the long run, what we expect to happen is that all inputs to production are going to be variable, because in the long run, enough time has passed for you to seek out a new building and find a new building with a different amount of rent, or maybe negotiate a new contract with your with your landlord. And that's the really big difference between short run and long run, where we assume that if all inputs are fixed, then that's going to be a totally different scenario for in shape of the long run supply curve than the short run. So that's something we're going to be looking for. Again, this is not really a calculation or theory-based question, or kind of a theory-based question, but very conceptual based. So we don't have to really do any work for this. Taking a look at the answer choices, then we can see that D is going to be the right answer choice. In the long run, all inputs are variable, while in the short run, at least one input is fixed. And so let's take a look at the answer choice, the explanation provided by the previous tutor. And they said the correct answer is D. In the long run, all inputs are variable, while in the short run, at least one input is fixed. And their explanation is rent, for example, may be fixed in the short run, but different in the long run. And so he used the same example as I did, which is great. And so I think this is just something to just remember, and nothing much else here. So this is a concept that just needs to be remembered. And that's kind of a basis for a lot of the assumptions we make in these economic problems. Okay, let's take a look at this next one. Although imperfect, which of the following is used as a measure of the standard of living? So we have real GDP times population, real GDP divided by population, nominal GDP times population, and nominal GDP divided by population. So what we first need to know is, are we going to use real GDP or nominal GDP? And we have to look at the difference between the two. And we know that GDP overall is the sum total of all the productivity or final goods and services produced in a country in a given amount of time, usually a year. The difference between real and nominal is that real GDP accounts for inflation, so it's not impacted by price changes, whereas nominal GDP is not going to accommodate for those price changes. So it is going to be affected by inflation and price differences between years. And so we always say that real GDP is a more accurate measure of productivity, or a more accurate measure of total market value than nominal GDP, because we want to know that real GDP reflects genuine productivity, and not just that this year the price of goods is 10% higher than they were last year, right? So real GDP is what we're going to go with as the most accurate measure of standard of living. And then we want it on what is known as a per capita basis. And what a per capita basis is essentially saying, if you were to divide all of the productivity in the nation by the number of people living in the nation, how much value would be available to each person on average. And so that's going to be calculated by dividing your total real GDP by the number of people in the country. So we're going to look for an answer as real GDP divided by population. And that's going to be answer choice number 2. So let's take a look at the answer provided by the previous tutor. So again, they chose the right answer, which is great. Real GDP divided by population. And let's see the explanation. The GDP is the aggregate of the market value of final goods and services produced in the economy in a year. That is correct. The real GDP represents the GDP which has been adjusted for price changes. Yet, the ratio of real GDP to the population of the country gives the per capita GDP, which is an indicator of the standard of living in the economy. Yes, right. So that's a good explanation. The next paragraph kind of clarifies why the question says, although imperfect, right? This is good. Maybe it's not necessary to know for this question, but definitely I've seen it a lot of questions on exams which test why GDP does not result in a perfect measure of productivity. So it is not a perfect indicator, as it only takes into account the goods and services that carry a monetary value and ignores everything else which is not marketed, such as leisure. It helps in an approximation of the standard of living by indicating the amount that is available for each individual in the economy. So yeah, very similar to what I was referring to in the beginning. And yeah, so I'll take a second and talk about a few things that GDP doesn't account for. So one thing that the GDP doesn't account for, like the previous tutor said, is going to be leisure. If I derive value maybe from staying at home and relaxing, and that provides value to me, but that's not because there's no monetary value attached to that. That is not valued in real GDP, right? Even though that provides that maybe I consider that to be productive. A more apt example might be work that is done in the house. So if I cook myself dinner, I've productively put together a bunch of ingredients into a meal that, if I worked at a restaurant, would be sold for money. The only difference is that when I cook at home and I eat it myself, because it's not being sold to anybody, there's no monetary uh, value of the final good that I produced, right, or final service that I produced, and so that gets missed by um, by GDP measures. So that's going to be home work, right? Not homework together, but work that you do at home. And another thing that the GDP misses is obviously going to be black markets. Um, Black markets are basically markets that take place under the radar, that are not, regulated by the government, and therefore there are no records of the transactions that are occurring there. One example of market goods and services that are being exchanged that are not included in GDP is the drug market. The drug market, and the black market for drugs, is a massive market that is worth billions of dollars, unfortunately. And that market is just not captured by any of the measures of GDP, whether it be, consumption or government spending or anything like that. So that's going to be something that is missed as well. So we want to just keep those things in mind as reasons why this is not going to be a perfect measure. It's a very good measure. It's not perfect. Okay, so that's going to be that. We can move on to the next question. I don't think we need to leave a note because everything you need to know is right in this first paragraph, and I think it was a good summation of what's going on there. Let's erase this. So the next question says, in a market economy, supply and demand are important for what reasons? And so let's take a look at the answer choices. Number one, they play a critical role in the allocation of the economy's scarce resources. I would say that that's definitely true. Number two, they determine how much of each good gets produced. Definitely true as well. Number three, they can be used to predict the impact on the economy of various events and policies. Also very true. That's why we have the supply and demand model. Number four, all of the above are correct. And so most like the answer choice should be all correct answer should be all of the above are correct. And so we can actually illustrate this by drawing a supply and demand graph. Draw a better one. We have our supply demand curve here, supply curve here. And so, the first, let's label this dollars and quantity of goods. The first thing that the first answer choice says, it plays a critical role in the allocation of the economy's scarce resources. And that's very true because, as we know, assuming no government intervention and assuming no market failure, we know that the supply and demand model at the intersection points is going to tell us the price at equilibrium in the market and the quantity that is traded in this market. And so that's going to tell us how the economy is going to allocate those resources. And similarly, it also tells us, number two, how much of each good gets produced. It tells us Q star, right? And finally, we also know it can be used to predict the impact of the economy on the economy of various events and policies. For example, maybe we say the government provides a price ceiling where price can't go above this level, then we know that that's going to result in a scarcity. That's going to result in lower prices, going to result in lower quantity traded, and all those things. And that's all told to us because we have a supply and demand model. So all three of these things are true and shown when we have these supply graphs drawn out. So let's take a look at the answer choices provided. So number four, all of the above are correct, and that is the right answer, which is good. And the explanation says the fundamental problem of economics is the problem of scarcity of resources that challenges our theoretically unlimited desires and needs. So that is the fundamental problem of economics. So that's good. The requirement to allocate our scarce resources in a way that our benefits are maximized and our costs are reduced is necessitated. That is true. The allocation is carried out through a price mechanism in a free market system, which is considered to be the most efficient of an economic system. So yes, if we want to talk about efficiency, then a free market is going to be the most efficient. Supply of a resource determines by its availability and accessibility governs how high or low it shall be priced along with the demand for that resource. Along with the demand of that resource. Yeah, so the intersection of supply and demand tells us the pricing and quantity. The higher demand and lower the supply, the greater is the price. The higher demand and the higher the supply, the moderate is the price. The lower demand and the higher the supply is, the lower is the price and lower the supply. So a lot of different combinations going on here. I think it's tricky when we say higher and lower. We want to make sure we're clarifying if we're talking about movements of the curve or movements along the curve. So that's something we might want to rephrase. But continue looking. Prices are determined in a market system to ensure an efficient allocation. Ultimately, it is the demand for a product in a market economy that decides the quantity of the goods to be produced. Is not just the demand, that's the supply and demand together, right? So that's also something we want to modify. Supply and demand are important because they govern economic policies and they can be crucial to various economic predictions. That's true. I think we can rewrite this so that it's a little bit more accurate and concise. I think there's a lot of maybe things here that might be a little bit more confusing to students. So let's take a look. So in a market economy, supply and demand are important because they play a critical role in the allocation of the economy's scarce resources. So let's start by explaining that. So we can start by saying, yes, that the fundamental problem of economics is the problem of scarcity of resources that challenges our theoretically unlimited desires and needs. The requirement to allocate our scarce resources in a way that benefits are maximized and our costs are reduced is necessary. And so we can just write this as the supply and demand curves provide us a way of visualizing how resources are allocated, or the interaction, let's say the interaction of the supply and demand curve provides a way of visualizing how resources are allocated. And that's going to be answering the first part, and then we also say additionally, we know that the intersection of the supply and demand curves will tell us both the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity that is produced at each for each good. Finally, the supply and demand model can show us the impact of government policies and various events by showing the outcomes when supply or demand curves are shifted or when government intervention takes place, right? So hopefully this explanation is going to more adequately sum up and answer the direct question at hand, which is which one of these is true. And so our first part, we talk about how this curve, this model allows us to visualize how resources are allocated based on the interaction of the supply and demand functions. The second says determines how much of each good gets produced, which is done at the equilibrium of each market's supply and demand curve, and finally can be used to predict the impact on the various events and on the economy of various events and policies. So why don't we clarify this by saying can show us the impact of events and government policies on price and quantity by showing the outcomes when supply and demand curves are shifted or when government intervention takes place. That I think is a little bit more concise and tells us a little bit more about the outcomes for this particular question, but is a correct solution. So let's take a look at this, and we can maybe erase this line. Whoops. And so this question says, an improvement in production technology will do which of the following? And so it will shift the supply curve to the right, shift the supply curve to the left, cause an upward movement on the supply curve, or cause a downward movement on the supply curve. So that's a good question. Again, a lot of exam questions I've seen are going to test your knowledge of the difference between a movement along the curve versus a movement of the curve, right? And so, when we talk about movement of the curve, we're normally talking about shifts. And the question is, when production technology is improved, is that going to cause a shift or a movement? And if it does cause a shift or a movement, in which way is that shift or movement? In which direction? So let's talk about that first question. Is this a shift or a movement? And so we know that the only thing that causes there to be movement along the supply curve is price change, right? Any other change in a determinant of supply that is, not price is going to result in a shift. And so because technology improvement is not price change, we know that 3 and 4 are not going to be right because those refer to movements, and that's not what we're talking about here. So the next question then is going to be, if this is a shift, is it going to increase supply or decrease supply? Is it going to shift to the right or to the left? And when we're talking about improvements of production technology, we know that production technology is a determinant of supply. And if technology improves, we assume that given the same amount of resources, suppliers or producers are going to be able to create more and produce more goods. And so that would be an increase in quantity supplied for every price level, and that translates into a shift in the supply curve to the right. And so we would say that answer choice number 1 would be the right answer. So we would see something along the lines of, it would look something like this, right? So taking a look at the answer key, let's make sure that's what we actually see. So yes, the answer key says a shift in the supply curve to the right. And so let's take a look at the explanation given. The explanation given says an improvement in production technology will decrease the average cost of production for the firm, making it more profitable for the firm to sell a greater output. This is true, right? Because if we think of average cost of production as total cost divided by quantity produced, right? If we can produce higher amounts of quantity, then the average average cost is going to go down, right? And so it's going to make it more profitable for the firm to sell a greater output. This is true. So the profit motive of the ration producer leads to an increase in the supply of the product, shifting the supply curve to the right? So we can go the equation route, or we could also go the kind of the more abstract theoretical route of if it costs less to produce, you can increase productivity with the same amount of resources, then you would increase the supply at all levels. The decrease in cost increases the supply, shifting the curve, which indicates that the quantity supplied at each price has increased, right? An upward downward on the supply curve indicates a change in quantity supplied due to the price and not a change in the supply entirely. So great, this is a good answer. It clarifies both the rationale for why supply is changing and shifting, and it also clarifies that you only see movement when you have a change in the quantity supplied due to the price. And so I think that's a great answer, and I don't think there's anything we need to change here. So let's take a look at this question. So this question says, which of the following best describes the state of the United States economy at the end of World War II? So we're given a couple answers. It was starting to come out of the Great Depression. It was deep into the Second Great Depression. It was experiencing steady growth from wartime production, and it was entering yet another recession. And so this is going to be more of a fact-based question, not really a fact and knowledge-based question. It's a fact and knowledge-based question, less so a model theory or calculation-based question. And so, I would say that after World War II, because the wartime economy was so oriented and stimulated for wartime production, producing cars, sorry, not cars, vehicles, medicine, bullets, guns, tanks, that employed a lot of people, and the economy actually was jump started from what the Great Depression was before. And so that was a big reason that helped stimulate the economy. So three is going to be the most accurate answer. So let's take a look at the answer choice given by the previous tutor. So the answer key says it was experiencing steady growth from wartime production. Yeah, that's true. And so let's see the explanation. So this is probably going to be a little bit more detailed because, again, this is more fact-based. And I'm just kind of going off the top of my head. The post-World War II economic expansion of the United States of America is also known as the golden age of expansion that witnessed a global economic boom as the war concluded. The economy of the United States grew from $228 billion in 1945 to $1.7 trillion in the 1970s. Post-war prosperity came as a great surprise because it was contrary to prediction of economic collapse after the war made by the experts in the pre-war era. And so the reason that people assumed that the economy would kind of drop was because when the war veterans came back and entered the civilian workforce, that was supposedly going to increase unemployment. And also, the economy would not have as much capital to work with because of wartime investment. But actually, contrary to what was predicted, the economy, supported by the GI Bill, saw a increase in GDP as people went to college and increased their skills and education, which enhanced their productivity. Okay, I think that's a good background. It's not necessary to know all of that detail. Definitely not necessary to know all those details. What you do just need to know is a general trend of the economy, and the trend of the economy was that after World War II, the wartime production translated rapidly into continued growth. And so, I think this answer key talks a lot about what happens after the war, but I think the question focuses more specifically on the snapshot at the end of World War II. What was the economy in the United States like? And I think that is definitely more cleanly answered as experiencing steady growth from wartime production. And so let's leave a little comment making sure that the answer key isn't kind of too off, and say, the solution focuses a bit much on, or let's say the previous, on the history after the war, in the decades after the war ended, but the question specifies more of a snapshot at the end of the war. It's better to, at that point in time, the U.S. economy was very wartime oriented, and experienced steady growth due to the high volume of production required. So I think that's a little bit more accurate because it talks more directly about what did it look like at the end of World War II. Correct solution, though. Okay, let's take a look at this question. So the agency responsible for regulating the money supply in the United States is which of the following? And so we have the comptroller of the currency, the U.S. Treasury, the Federal Reserve, or the U.S. Bank. And so out of all of these, we know that the agency responsible for monetary policy, which includes regulation of the money supply, is going to be the Federal Reserve. I think the comptroller of the currency is Canadian. The U.S. Treasury is a department that is under the executive branch, but the federal what's different is that the Federal Reserve is technically part of the United States, but it's not under the executive branch. It's a separate agency, and so it's independent. And so that's a big difference between the U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve. And then we have the U.S. Bank, which is not a specific bank, maybe if we said the United States Central Bank, then that would also be correct. But U.S. Bank is not correct. So Federal Reserve is going to be the correct answer. And that's, again, not theory, not calculation. This is just, kind of more background knowledge this is something that, most of you guys will need to be familiar with just in terms of the facts of some of the background for economics. So let's take a look at the answer choice. Federal Reserve, the money supply in the United States is controlled and regulated by its monetary authority in the central bank, the Federal Reserve System. Federal Reserve is responsible for regulating the commercial banking system of the country. It does all these things. It does so by influencing the credit creation capacity of the commercial banks through monetary policy instruments, right, such as the federal funds rate, discount rate, reserve requirement ratio, and open market operations. Yeah, definitely. That is correct. And so I think the only thing to take this a step further is that almost all of these tools that the Federal Reserve uses is in order to regulate the money supply. And because the money supply is directly related to the interest rates and the productivity. And so I would add just an asterisk that says all those monetary policy instruments end up regulating the money supply, either directly or indirectly. Yeah. So let's take a look at the next question. So during a recession, what is one way governments try to encourage growth? So let's take a look at the question. The answer choices: by increasing unemployment benefits, by requiring firms to maintain production, by stopping government spending, or by eliminating all tax breaks. So I would say that the correct answer here is, well, we have to think about, what is this question asking us about? And what it's really asking us about is fiscal policy, right? It's basically saying when the government is dealing with a recession or recessionary gap, the government is going to engage in fiscal policy. And that's essentially saying, how do I get money into the hands, or how do I stimulate the economy, right? How do I increase GDP? So one way is there's two ways that the government is normally going to address this problem. The first way is going to be through increased government spending, right? And so basically saying, if the government purchases things, that's going to, from the private sector, but that money goes into the hands of individuals, and those individuals go turn around and spend that money on elsewhere. And so when the government spends a lot of money, it's stimulating the economy by this multiplier effect of getting people to go out and spend. Right? Because increasing spending, increasing consumption is one of the biggest ways that you can address a recession. That's one way. The other way, a little bit more indirect, but still fiscal policy, is to reduce taxes. And so what reducing taxes does is it lets people and individuals have more money on hand to work with. And that means they will go out and spend more. And so we're going to look for an answer choice that is along one of those two lines. So let's take a look at number one. So by increasing unemployment benefits. So one outcome of a recession is increased unemployment, right? We know that that happens when we have a recession. And unemployment benefits are basically money that the government provides to those who are unemployed during a recession, in order to help them between looking for jobs. And so, one point of providing unemployment benefits is that if people are getting the money to in their pockets, and they're going to be more likely to go out and spend more. So that actually is one way to increase benefits for stimulate the economy by getting money into the hands of the people. The one caveat I have, so I would say this is a good answer. The one caveat I have is the other impact of increasing unemployment benefits is to reduce the motivation for unemployed people to go out and look for another job, because the cost of unemployment is now lower, right? If I'm being unemployed and I receive no money from the government, then I have a very, very high motivation and incentive to go out and look for a new job because I need money. If unemployment benefits are high, then even if I don't find a job, I still make a certain amount of money, and that might decrease my motivation to get back into the labor force or to find another job, and that might be bad for growth. So I don't, it depends on how you're looking at this. I would still say that this is probably the best answer. Let's look at the other ones just to make sure. Number two, by requiring firms to maintain production. Um, you know, I don't know if this is something that governments do. Governments rarely mandate that firms continue to produce, especially in a free market. That's not something that we normally do unless it's a time of emergency, and a recession does not usually count as that. And so I don't think this is, properly a tool that governments are often going to use to encourage growth. Um, it's not one that we normally see, and it's not one I've seen seen advocated for by any like economics textbooks or anything like that. So I don't think that's going to be the best answer. Number three, by stopping government spending. So this is actually the opposite of what we want to do, right? We don't want to stop government spending. If government were to stop spending, that would make the recession way worse. Because if government stops spending, then even less money flows to the private sector, and even less money is going to go out, and less people are going to go out and exchange goods and services in the market, right? So we definitely know three is not the right answer. Number four, by eliminating all tax breaks. And so again, this is the opposite of what we want to do, right? If we eliminate all tax breaks, so what is a tax break, right? A tax break is when I get to pay less in my taxes because I can claim a dependent, or maybe I have a small business and it didn't make enough money. Like these are all reasons why I might pay less in my taxes than I normally would. If we eliminate those tax breaks, what that means is people end up paying more taxes, right? Because there are less ways to reduce your taxable income. There's less ways to reduce your taxes overall. And so by eliminating tax breaks, what you're essentially doing is you're increasing taxes. And so that is going to take away money from the private sector, take away money from individuals, and that will be bad for the economy as well. So I would say, if for this question, A is probably the best answer, because by increasing unemployment benefits, you give people more money, and that money can be used in the market, even if the person doesn't have a job. So let's take a look at the answer choice provided by the the previous tutor. So basically, they chose by eliminating all tax breaks. So again, this is not going to be the right answer, and we're going to take a look at the explanation just to see what maybe went wrong here. So the previous answer was that by eliminating all tax breaks, that would stimulate growth. So a recession is a period of low business activity due to lower aggregate demand in the market, causing a loss in profitability for firms. Not exactly right. Like a recession, or what we refer to as a recessionary gap, maybe is when aggregate demand falls under long run, like the short run aggregate demand equilibrium is less than the long run aggregate supply might be, and so that is going to cause there to be this recessionary gap, and that's normally what recession is caused by. So typically it's defined as an economic contraction indicated by a declining GDP growth rate for 2 consecutive quarters. An economy can only be rescued from a period of recession if the aggregate demand in the market is encouraged through increased government spending and investments or reducing taxes. So yes, this is correct. Well, again, saying the economy can only be rescued through that method is wrong, because we also, knowing that we have fiscal policy, which talks about government spending and taxes, but we also have monetary policy, which talks about the effect that the Fed can have on the money supply, and that is also going to be a way that you can come back from a recession. So that's not quite accurate, actually. Increasing unemployment benefits will increase the incentive to not work. This will cause an increase in the unemployment rate. So again, this is something that I mentioned, which is why I don't think it's a perfect answer. That being said, I don't think that this tutor has considered the possibility of stimulating spending by increasing the amount of money that people have in times of unemployment. And we also know that historically, we have seen unemployment benefits increase during times of recessions. So we know that this is something that governments do to address a high unemployment and increase growth during recessions. So maybe that's not necessarily the best explanation there. A regulation that requires firms to maintain production will force firms out of the market. This is likely to be true if you require firms to maintain production, even though there's less demand. That's usually going to cause firms to suffer a loss because they're not being able to sell as much of their products relative to how much they're producing. So you should let firms optimally decide, where marginal revenue, marginal costs are equal, and that's what they should be deciding off of, not off of government regulation. The third answer choice is government spending ceases to exist. There will be an increase in the unemployment rate due to a lack of investments in the economy. Again, pretty good explanation. If government stops spending, then the economy is going to be way, way even worse than if the government just kept spending neutral. Elimination of all tax breaks is one of the ways in which government tries to encourage growth. Reduced taxes increases the real income of a consumer. So I think the tutor just misinterpreted what eliminating tax breaks means. It is not eliminating taxes. It is eliminating exemptions from taxes, right? So by eliminating the exemptions from taxes, you're effectively increasing the effective tax rate. So this is the point of confusion. So let's make sure this is modified to reflect the correct solution. So let's first reduce, let's change this sentence here. An economy can only be rescued from a period of recession if the aggregate demand in the market is encouraged through government spending or reducing taxes. We know that's not the case. We say an economy, a recession can be addressed through both fiscal and monetary policy. Governments engaging in fiscal policy will typically either increase government spending or reduce taxes with the goal of increasing overall spending / consumption in the economy. Okay, so that's clarified. So let's take a look at let's write the correct answer first. We said the correct answer should be 1 or I, by increasing unemployment benefits. So increasing unemployment benefits is one way that governments often try to increase growth during a recession. The unemployment benefits is referred to monies received by those who are unemployed, by increasing the flow of benefits to those who are unemployed, and knowing that unemployment is high during a recession, the government can increase the amount of disposable income in the economy, which would lead to higher consumption / spending. That would stimulate the economy. So that's our explanation for why answer choice 1 is correct. So let's take a look at answer choice 2. Requiring firms to maintain production. We can just use the same logic that the previous tutor replied, because this was correct. This is also correct. And then elimination of tax breaks would increase the amount that people need to pay in taxes by taking away exemptions that were previously available. This effectively increases taxes and decreases the amount of money in the hands of individuals. This would further contract the economy rather than stimulate growth. Okay, so I think this kind of answer is a little bit more adequate for explaining what is probably happening in this scenario. Again, I do want to note that increasing unemployment benefits, mixed bag. Most likely, it's going to increase funding. On the other hand, we do know that it can slow recovery by reducing the amount of by reducing the incentive to go out and look for work. That being said, we might interpret this as if we increase unemployment benefits, we would encourage growth in the short term, but we might lengthen the time it would take to come out of a recession relative to other approaches to stimulating growth, such as increasing government spending or decreasing taxes, which are probably more directly efficient and aren't going to suffer from this incentive problem. But we do know that limiting all tax breaks is definitely not going to encourage growth. So I'm going to mark this as incorrect. I actually think this might be the same problem as before, although imperfect. Which of the following is used as a measure of the standard of living? We talked about how it's real GDP divided by population. Let's make sure this answer is still correct. Real GDP and population. The economic variable that is used as a measure of standard of living, despite being imperfect, is the per capita real gross domestic product. Per capita GDP is a ratio of real GDP with respect to population in the country. That's correct. Its inefficiency arises from its quantitative nature that precludes qualitative aspects, doesn't reflect work done by homemakers. So that was what we talked about, like homework. The quality of environment, right? That's another one. Services provided to oneself. So that's my cooking example. It also excludes the value of leisure and happiness. So yeah, this is a good answer. It talks about the direct reason why this ratio is what we look to. And it also talks about the inefficiencies of this measure, which doesn't perfectly capture what we see happening in the real world. So it's going to be correct. So when inflation is blank, the Fed aims to slow the economy. And so when inflation is we would say that when inflation is high, the Fed aims to slow the economy, because what inflation is high, if we know the Fed is trying to slow the economy, what we know is that there's going to be expansionary gap, right? An expansionary gap is basically where you have, oops, that's awkward. Let's try and erase all this stuff. Basically, we have, or let's just go to the next slide. There we go. We have a, let's try this one more time. Let's say this is long run aggregate supply, and we have short run aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply. So this short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, demand, aggregate demand. So this is what we refer to as a expansionary gap, where the short run equilibrium has a quantity that is higher than the optimal quantity, which is in the long run aggregate supply. So this is a situation which is where the Fed would want to slow the economy down, because the economy is basically growing too fast, right? And so that expansionary gap is tied to high inflation. So we expect that when inflation is high, that's when the Fed is slowing the economy down because of this expansionary gap. So the Federal Reserve, let's take a look at the answer. The Federal Reserve aims to slow down the economy by adopting a contractionary monetary policy when the inflation rate is high. So this is correct. The contractionary monetary policy is used, or contractionary policy is used when we're dealing with an expansionary gap. So the increase in aggregate demand leads to an increase in prices, right? And so we can see here that if we would ideally want aggregate demand to be here, then at this price level, that's lower than the current price level, right? So we have P 0, or sorry, P star and P1, right? So the price is higher, and that's again what inflation refers to. So when inflation rate becomes aggressive, Fed attempts to decrease the money supply, which is what the monetary policy is oriented to, which reduces spending capacity of consumers and brings aggregate demand down, and that moderates the inflation rate. It decreases the money supply either by increasing interest rates, right, or selling government securities and bonds under open market operations, basically exchanging bonds for money in the public hands, and that takes away money from people. So yeah, this is a good example. I don't think there's anything wrong with this, and so we're going to mark that correct as well. And I think that's about all the time we have today. And so we'll cover the rest on our next session. But hopefully this was helpful and that we've taken a look at some of the most commonly missed questions. And other than that, I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day and are staying safe at home. Take care, everybody.